Hello everyone, I'm Drifting, and today I'm going to be talking about a fun web novel I recently read called I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu Game. Before we started, I want to quickly preface this by saying I'm going to go on a couple of short detours and tangents along the way. I really enjoy deep diving into genre and analyzing and reviewing a web novel from a lot of different perspectives. So I'm going to be mentioning a lot of popular web novel titles, well-known web novel titles in the genre, and even on some older web novels. So if you're interested in a similar story or genre, definitely go check that out. If you want to directly go to the review and summary of I Became a Genius Mage the Cthulhu game, I recommend skipping the first 5 or 6 minutes, although I go on a little bit of tangents, so it might be a little bit longer, but I'll leave some video chapters and timestamps that you can go to. But yeah, I'll try and make this as quick as possible, but I really wanted to mention some of my recent web novel reads just because I thought it'd be fun to cover, and just because there's some fun future video ideas I thought I might go over. So yeah, recently I haven't been making a lot of videos. I've definitely been busy reading and adding things to my collection. I read as if my life's on the line sometimes, but I mostly read for fun. So when I'm reading, I'm not really particularly thinking about how I want to review a web novel. So I will go back and reread something to find what made that web novel unique and fun for me. So yeah, recently I covered web novels. There was an urban fantasy web novel I went over, such as A Letter from the Future Every Day. Urban fantasy and entertainment is one of my favorite genres, right? Urban fantasy like Spare Me Great Lord, Full-Time Artist, Director of the Music Department, Disaster Artist, 1928 Hong Kong Businessman, My 1983. Various professional writing, business, lawyer, doctors web novels. Those are classic, right? Superstars of Tomorrow. Recently read a fun one called Become Famous Another Day, but urban fantasy and entertainment is generally the genre that I enjoy reading. But I also still consistently read X-Rank Supporting Role Replay in a Prestigious School, X-Rank SRPS, just shortened to X-Rank. Really fun community. I really enjoy reading the story of X-Rank, so that's just one I maintain to continue to read the updates with. But the two web novels I considered making a video on, one of the titles is called Cataclysm Card King. It has a unique, crazy protagonist with card abilities similar to Card Apprentice in this horror game steampunk environment. A lot of its magic systems and the protagonist deals with this environment in a unique way that I thought it'd be just a fun story to review. The other web novel I considered making a video on is an Abyss web novel. Abyss web novels have a recurring trait of having a very deep storyline to them. There's always a lot of depth. So this Abyss web novel is no exception. It's called Paradise Abyss Doesn't Allow Idle Wanderers. The main character Su Bu Xian deals with problems in a unique way through this weirdness game setting. Weirdness game and horror game are slightly different, so I thought it'd be a fun web novel to go over. Other Abyss Web novels I recently read is Abyss Wanderer, which had a very unique science fiction direction to it, which is not a surprise since Abyss Wanderer was inspired by a very convoluted science fiction novel story called Cyber Heroes. Other things Abyss Wanderer is inspired by is Cyberpunk 2077, as well as The Lord of Mysteries by Cuttlefish Loves Diving. Now, Weaver, recently made a video on his like top 5 web novels, and I think he mentioned that Cuttlefish Loves Diving also wrote Throne of Magical Arcana. Lord of Mysteries is one of these huge web novel touchstones and benchmarks in the web novel landscape, alongside The King's Avatar, The Legendary Mechanic, Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, and even Solo Leveling. Um, I would compare it to like Demon Slayer or Jujutsu Kaisen, one of like the very popular web novels right now. A lot of these web novels have definitely changed the web novel landscape as a whole. They inspired a new genre and style of writing. But I wouldn't quite put it at the level of a Full Metal Alchemist or an Art Online, Cowboy Bebop. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, I would say, is slightly much more influential. Um, Lord of Mysteries is just much more recent, and it's comparable to a popular web novel, right? Popular titles such as Inso's Law, Overgear, The Novels Extra, Trash of the Count's Family, a little bit of Solo Leveling, The Legendary Mechanic, are similar to anime series like One Punch Man, Boku no Hero Academia, Assassination Classroom, Fire Force, and Black Clover, and the fact of it just like recency. There are always newer web novel stories coming out, so it's always fun to read. But we'll see in the long run how Lord of Mysteries pans out, right? Because Release That Witch and Legendary Moonlight Sculptor used to be huge titles, and were definitely a lot more popular when they came out. But a lot of them have inspired genres or were just unique when they were written. So I've also been reading some Ming Dynasty historical period pieces, right? Historical fantasies an interest of mine. So I read a web novel series like Song of Laughter, Chief Assistant, Immortal Man in the Reckless Dynasty, Non-Salted Fish's Life in the Three Kingdoms. Various modern person returns to the past, and you see a lot of political events. It's always a very unique setting to it. Um, and I came across an artifact web novel called National Treasure Expert. Now, a lot of treasure hunt web novels, especially on the web novel platform, is much more about urban fantasy and wealth accumulation with a little bit of wish fulfillment, where they use their magical ability to identify an artifact and sell it. Whereas some artifact web novels, like I Became a Cultural Appraiser for the Country or Underworld, Netherworld Investigator on Wuxia World, is much more about identifying historical objects. Sometimes they use their golden finger cheat ability to go back into the past and actually meet these historical figures. Or their magical ability allows them to bring historical objects from the past to the present and analyze the history and journey that a historical object makes. So it's much more about the cultural appreciation and looking into the history of a particular culture that I find very unique in a lot of these artifact web novels. So that's a fun genre to read. I read a DD web novel called Father of Mawe that I found was really cool, and then I read some fan fictions as well, right? Like Conan, I'm Not a Snake Disease, but it's always the Asian fan fiction series and shows that I find unique, right? The Legend of Tegan Kamen Rider are fan fiction series that I haven't really seen before, so it's interesting to see a lot of those worlds written in a web novel. But the web novel I recently came across that I was really surprised by was a Korean fan fiction called Rest Assured, I'm Just an Ordinary Bandit. It's very much a behind the scenes, economically focused web novel, so economic development, but it's set in like this Korean characteristic landscape of like wuxia martial arts. And that's because it's inspired by one of the huge Korean web novels in manhwa, Volcanic Age. Um, it inspired this whole genre of Korean wuxia martial arts called murim, right? So you have various Korean hanbok outfits, rivers and lakes, and various gang settings. It's kind of like a Korean cultivation martial arts story that I found very cool. I've also been reading a lot of Korean web novels. If you couldn't tell from a lot of my previous web novel videos, such as 30 Years Have Passed Since the Prologue, an Academy web novel, Genius Mage, Double Life of a Genius Editor, Game Director Returns from Hell, right? Extra supporting role replay in prestigious school. Terminally ill raid leader makes the raid a success. But the two I came across was Martial God Returns to Level 2, which is your classic dungeon, do-over, regressor, second chance web novel, like various like tower and dungeon abilities. And an Academy web novel called Academy Squinting, where slit-eyed character at the Academy where a student has a negative charm stat and then has a lot of this foreknowledge. It's very cool, similar to Real Life Player, Extra Academy Survival Guide, Surviving the Academy. I'll be going over Academy web novels, right? Like Undercover Professor at the Academy, The Villain Wants to Live. A lot of those Academy series, as we discussed, I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game. But yeah, definitely been reading a lot of Korean web novels, so it's very unique. But the two I've constantly been keeping up with the updates besides extra supporting role replay and prestigious school is Cicada, which is this fun urban fantasy espionage web novel, and one which had a really strong storyline that I really enjoy reading, right? Like the Abyss web novels, Paradise Abyss Doesn't Allow Idle Wanderers, has a unique story to it. I think it's slightly stronger, and Cataclysm Card King, also very unique. Definitely some arcs are better than others, but Don't Confiscate My Citizenship as is one that I've always consistently enjoyed reading. Um, the main character Lanchi, right, or Ranch Wilford as it translates to, is a very unique character. There's a lot of comedic moments. It's another card ability web novel as well. He has a secret identity. He has a secret identity, Rocky McCarthy. But there's a lot of fun characteristics in that web novel. I'm just having a hard time justifying making a video because there's a lot of similar genres and overlap. So it's a little bit too soon to make that. But I thought that was really fun. Um, Other Abyss web novels I thought were also unique was After Sleeping Soundly. The main character Musu has a little bit of a depressive personality, but it's still a fun like read. There's still a lot of funny moments to it. And Secret Dice, which has D&D abilities with like a luck special ability as well. Um, but yeah, Abyss web novels always have a very deep storyline. So any Abyss web novels are very unique, especially weirdness game ones. So let's get back to I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game. I'm going to try my best at pronouncing the author's name using the Google Translate function. I think the author's name is Gihan Jasik, which just translates to Precious Child. And I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game was published by Kakao under one of its subsidiaries, Golem Factory. And I have a unique detour, a tangent I want to go to, talking about web novel publishing and the web novel landscape as a whole. A lot of interesting news coming out. Kakao, which owns Wuxia World, in early 2024 acquired a translation site called Volair Web Novels. They translated works such as Still Wait for Me, Show Me the Money, Reign of Hunters. You can see a lot of those titles on screen that they transferred over. But it reminded me a lot of the 2018 acquisition of Gravity Tales by Webnovel. Obviously, different environment and different circumstances. But I'd really thought I'd mention, a lot of the interesting web novel news that came out, right? Ed Volair, who is a huge contributor to the site, I think they owned it. And they're still a huge part of the Wixie World community. Ed Volair is the host of the Wixie World podcast, has done a lot to, translation as a whole. But yeah, it really reminded me of the 2018 of the translation site Gravity Tales. Other recent acquisitions I thought were very interesting was Naver, Kakao's competitor, which owns Webtoons, recently bought Wattpad back during the pandemic of like 2019, 2020. They also bought one of the huge Korean publishing um, sites, Munpia, right? Kakao. They created Tapas, a webtoons and web novel media platform. They bought Wuxia World and Radish, and I think they worked with C&J Entertainment and whatever. But there's a lot of Korean companies. In China, you have like these huge web novel publishers such as Tencent, Qidian, QQ Reading, Chuangshi, Hongxiu, um, web novel. That's like one huge conglomerate, which is kind of insane. You have smaller sites such as JJWXC, which is kind of like this AO3 Chrysanthemum Garden, mostly for romance web novels sort of environment. You have Feilu or Falu, different pronunciations, which is a fan fiction site similar to Quotev or Wattpad. And then you have like the two licensors, 17K and Zongheng. For the Japanese publishing landscape, there's a lot of SK and H names, right? These people, they publish a lot of light novels, which they turn into manga and send to anime production houses. You have Kodansha, Karakawa, Yan Press, Yoseru, Hitsubashi Group, Shueisha, and Shogakukan. And then in the English web fiction sphere, you have like Royal Road, Scribble Hub, a lot of smaller sites like Mega Novel or Good Novel trying to compete in that sphere. Oftentimes, a lot of Royal Road web fictions or like where they publish on top web fiction will publish on independent sites like with Midorino, or they will send their works to Amazon Publishing. But recently, there's been a lot of licensing agreements, especially with Webtoons, right? Webtoons would license a lot of their works to Netflix in One Classroom and A Man's Man. So it's interesting to see a lot of English web fictions being licensed to Webtoons through either books, like Read Trailer Trash, right? Webtoons is definitely one avenue that we're seeing a lot of web fictions go to. So it's interesting to see those developments in the web novel sphere. So I thought I'd quickly mention that before we get started. So yeah, I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game. It has over 500 chapters, so it's a relatively longer web novel. For context, a lot of Korean web novels only go up to 200 chapters. So, the web novel author is Gihan Jasig is very accomplished. He's written a couple stories before, and there's a very unique storyline to it. It's written, as far as I know, 2023. But even in the 100 translated chapters, there's a lot of unique events that happen since I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game stands at the intersection of a lot of different genres that I want to talk about. So it's a really unique web novel in that sense. I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game was also covered by one of the great web novels YouTubers and content creators, Penchong. Penchong usually covers exclusively Korean web novels, so it's really a testament to the quality that he went over it. And while mentioning Penchong, I thought I might as well mention a couple of other web novel YouTubers and content creators that I'm aware of. I just shout them out as such. So we have Gold Ferret, Weaver, who recently made his top 5 web novel videos. Vitamin Ilu made a cool video. You have Seisaku Desk, who kind of like does more business related videos. But you have Destiny Suji, who's an author and VTuber in the web novel landscape. I thought was really cool. Butterfly Valley is another Korean web novel YouTuber and reviewer. Ferd, who made the animation for Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint. Then you have like Red Chaos, Weeb Psycho. There's two webtoon content creators for like Lookism and related series. I think they're going to do Man's Man as well. But I'll have their names on screen. and Ed Volair, right, host of the Wixie World podcast. So these are some of the web novel YouTubers and content creators that I'm aware of. But it's always fun to see more web novel content and like to see the web novel community like expand on YouTube. So that's always really cool. So definitely go check some of those guys out. But yeah, I became a genius mage in the Cthulhu game. The author wrote this introduction or description to the series. It goes, Paju, the city of hope, peace, and madness, and the tale of a mage trapped in a bizarre world. And it sounds to relay Dead Cthulhu wage dreaming. So this is a fun urban fantasy web novel with, magic elements to it because it's a genius mage. It's set in the Korean city of Paju, right? So it has a lot of Korean characteristics, Korean background. Um, but because it's located on like the South Korean peninsula and it's like relatively isolated and it's this urban fantasy location, there's not a lot of international conflicts. There's not a lot of nationalism. So I thought that was very unique in that sense. And it's very similar to a lot of, classic Korean web novels, right? The popular ones are like Solo Leveling, um, The Legendary Mechanic, in terms of scope, Spare Me Great Lord Nomenclature of the Night in terms of urban fantasy, and you can see a lot of the elements of like dungeon web novels in urban fantasy, like with Solo Leveling, which is one of the popular dungeon tower web novels. So yeah, you can tell from the title, I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game. This is very influenced by magic web novels. Magic web novels is always a fun environment, right? We see that with the versatile mage, there's a lot of warlock and necromancer magic routes for Korean web novels, right? Genius warlock, Seal Station necromancer, Frozen Mage returns after 4,000 years. The Frozen Mage returns, Genius Mage returns after 4,000 years with Lucas Trauman. Returnees magic must be special. Reincarnation of the 8th class mage with Ian Page. So a lot of these mages web novels deal with Second Life, Second Chance regressor web novel, right? Second Life Ranker was one of those web novels. Um, but there's a lot of different routes that a mage's web novel can go over. The Academy route is a very popular route, which I want to discuss in a little bit. Um, but another unique element is that this is not just a magic web novel. This is set in a Cthulhu game setting, right? One unique aspect of this game is that it's a broken game, so there's a lot of interesting layover with that as well. I want to discuss, and I also want to discuss a little bit about the history and like development of gaming web novels, but I'm not going to get into that right now. We'll get into that a little bit later. So there's a lot of unique game elements to this web novel, right? Which is explained through like the Cthulhu mythos and H.P. Lovecraft characters, because it is a Cthulhu game. Definitely makes this story unique. A lot of H.P. Lovecraft characters, such as the Yellow Emperor, the Awakened Ones, or like the Ancient Ones, which are these outer realm beings, come to play a huge role in this web novel, right? Nyar Lahotep, um, Migo, Shub-Niggurath, like the Black Goat. So there's a lot of unique factions and cults in this web novel, just because this is a has a Cthulhu background or story to it. And my knowledge of Cthulhu comes from a lot of like D&D Waterdeep campaigns and web novel YouTubers such as Puff and Forest, who make a lot of fun videos on it, right? So this Cthulhu world, because of these outer beings, they're so far beyond human comprehension. They cause a lot of confusion, madness, and fear, right? A lot of factions. And so to deal with that, right? In a lot of D&D campaigns, you have a physical health component. This one, you have a mental health component, right? Mental sanity. Where if you lose too much mental health hit points, you become insane, right? Or you go crazy because of all the madness and chaos these outer beings cause, right? These outer beings are just very far beyond human comprehension, and they have magical abilities that people can't understand that cause that level of madness. So this is not a deities web novel like you'd see with Sword of Daybreak, World of Deities, I'm the God of Games, Cthulhu Going Alone, or like Leveling with the Gods. Korean web novels do deities in a very unique way, right? A lot of deities web novels, you have a lot of like factions fighting, and then it's like all about ascending godhood and like accumulating believers. Korean web novels take a relatively hands-off approach with a lot of these outer beings. In a lot of Korean web novels, they refer to them as constellations, kind of like these stars or viewers of a particular world. We see that with leveling with the gods or omniscient reader's viewpoint, where these constellations or greater, stronger beings kind of bestow patrons special abilities, which I thought was unique. I'm going to be defining a lot of unique Korean terminology, so it's going to be fun to go over some of them. So yeah, there's a lot of game elements to it. There's a lot of familiar game routes. So our main character Kim Shin-woo has played this game for hundreds and thousands of hours. This is the 1789th character he's created, right? Um, and he goes this magic ability route. He creates this glass cannon build. And for his achievements, right, he gets a lot of special abilities. He can adjust his stats. Usually you're stuck between, 8 and 20. He can adjust it however he wants. So he lowers his strength stat and maxes out his intelligence stat. We see similar thing with single player only, where the main character adjusts his stat to the maximum charmed stat, and a lot of hijinks ensue. But our main character, Kip Shinwa, adjust his stat to the max 30. So a lot of his magical abilities are revolved around this glass cannon mage build. He gets 11 buffs and 11 penalties. A lot of his buffs revolve around being a stronger mage. He gets stronger spells, a longer range extension. He casts spells quicker. He doesn't have to use chanted or use a verbal component, so he can chant using gestures or silent casting. You can chant twice as fast. He can absorb spells really quickly. He has a lot of like ancient knowledge he's familiar with, and a lot of his abilities revolve around being a stronger mage, which is just for his stat sheet, and a lot of his penalties revolve around being a weaker character, right? Because he's a low strength stat, so he's easily injured. Healing potions aren't as effective. He's weak to disease. He can't use heavy combat weapons. He's weak to close combat, and all sorts of this negative strength debuffs, right? So he's injury prone and so on and so forth. His main character also has special perks and abilities for completing this achievement and going to this world. He's overseen by one of the outer beings, Nyarlathotep. Although he has pays a lot of attention to this main character, it's relatively hands off and much more an urban fantasy exploration web novel. So he has this ability called Feast Offering or a dinner plate, where his constitution is particularly desirable to these outer beings. So a lot of cults and factions want to sacrifice him to their ancient ones, or like these outer beings observing this doomed world, right? Our main character also has other traits such as magic predation, which he can absorb magic really quickly. But also he has this thing called the destroyed mind feat, right? And he's immune to a lot of these confusion and fear status debuffs because he's already insane, right? So he receives two madnesses in return that he's not immune to, so two insanities. One is a mask obsession, and the other is a fear of rats. He can overcome these madnesses, but in order to do so, he would receive a new one in return. So a lot of these madnesses revolve around various unique story arcs. He first acquires the fear of rats at the very beginning. Then he has like the fear of the number 13, fear of fish, which eludes the deepened ones, and the fear of blood. So a lot of these fears and madnesses are very intertwined with the story arcs. So it's really fun to see a lot of these features throughout like the many chapters of the story. His first madness is mask obsession. Notice it's not a fear or a phobia of something. Mask obsession is just a very unique character trait of our main character. Um, we see masks are definitely a way to express a lot of these relationships with outer beings. He is so obsessed with masks that he always has to be wearing a mask, and he has a huge desire to acquire masks. Well, there's Mesoamerican masks, Sub-Saharan African masks, Bantu masks, Crow masks, Plague Doctor masks, Crow masks, Masquerade, Ballroom masks, Phantom of the Opera masks. The couple that he comes across is like a Mask of the Faceless One, a Three-Eyed Mask, a Pallid Caracosa Mask, which relates to the Yellow Emperor, Dancer's Masks, and many, many more, right? So his obsession with collecting masks is very much intertwined with the story, right? The big bad evil guy, like Dok Go Hyun, I think, or whatever, who's in charge of one of the huge factions, the Hansei Ilyo Church, um, arranges a party, and then there's a lot of masks involved. So our main character, because of his special traits, has to get involved. And it's a lot of these small character traits that differentiate our main character differently from other web novel stories, right? An X-Rank supporting role replay in a prestigious school. The main character Jo Yun Shin is always wearing a crow mask or a plague doctor mask to gain the attention of one of these demon observers, Sidelium, right? Similar to Constellation, and then he gets some powers in return that I find very unique. And masks kind of like obscure his identity in a unique way that I find really fun. So as I discussed before, this web novel has a lot of game elements to it. Our main character Kim Shinwa is described as a stagnant water character, which reminds me of Stagnant Water of the Apocalypse or Sandweaver of the Burnt Desert. Um, Stagnant water has a similar connotation, a negative connotation to nerd or otaku. It's someone who's obsessed with something, right? And this Cthulhu game is known as a broken game. So Kim Shin was one of the few gamers playing this. He's put hundreds and thousands of hours, gotten all these achievements. This is his 1,789th character. So he's played this video game a lot of times and he knows all these routes. And this is a very familiar trope, which I find unique, right? Where you have a main character who's really obsessed with this video game and has a lot of knowledge, and then, it's a very familiar route for a regressor to do over a web novel. We see this with X-Rank supporting role replay in Prestigious School, Plamago. Jo Yin Shin is one of the few players that actually plays Plamago, so when he reincarnates into this academy setting, he's familiar with it. Omniscient Reader's Viewpoint, even though Kim Dokja is the only reader, he's a fan of this particularly bad web novel, so he is very familiar with this world. The novel's extra. A lot of these web novel stories, you have a character who's obsessed with something, and then they're the only person who has that knowledge, so they get reincarnated to that world. It's just a different flavor of isekai. A lot of villainous web novels start out that way, and Academy web novels start out that way as well, right? Because when you're familiar with all the bad ending routes, you can navigate through all of that. The main heroines want to kill me, Demon Limited Hunter, right? Undercover Professor at the Academy, Extra Academy Survival Guide. The villain wants to live, 30 years have passed since the prologue. A lot of these Academy web novels go with this magic setting, go this route as well, because you have a lot of this foreknowledge and stories. A fun Academy web novel I thought I'd mention is I Became a Flashing Genius at the Magic Academy. A very unique web novel as well. So just fun special abilities that I thought was a relatively longer one, has like over 500 chapters. So definitely go check that one out as well. But yeah, a lot of this magic ability is like intertwined with masks. So there's a lot of interesting story arcs that go with it, which really reminds me of Doro Hey Doro, where where masks are tied to a user's magic ability. So definitely a cool character trait. In terms of the game aspect, there's a lot of like influences as well, right? Like it's obviously inspired by one of the huge Korean web novel touchstones and benchmarks, Solo Leveling, which inspired that whole dungeon and tower arc, right? So there's a lot of magical abilities that allude to it. But from a game aspect, our main character possesses the character of a video game character he created, right? He created a new character and then turns into that character. We saw that with the main player hides his past, where the protagonist becomes the character he created back in high school, right? Granfell, the demon hunter. And there's a lot of embarrassment revolving around his role-playing abilities and his profession. So I always find that very fun. But game web novels have definitely progressed a lot from being stuck in a video game with Sword Art Online, or my personal favorite, Log Horizon. Gaming web novels have always occupied a very unique space, right? Hack, Batum are definitely some of the early anime series. Before we get into a lot of the gaming classics, such as Emperor of Solo Play, One Man Army, Reincarnation of the Strongest Sword God, Rebirth of Thief Who Roamed the World. So a lot of these older titles revolving around certain professions, right? Or mages and thieves professions, single player only, possessing nothing. A lot of these game series are where the gamer reincarnates back to the past and then kind of uses his special ability and it turns it into an urban fantasy of sorts, right? A lot of more modern narrations revolve around VR, right? Like the Genius Architect, where there's a hybrid between reality and the video game world, like with the World Online, Arc, Legendary Moonlight Sculptor. These were huge popular game titles. Then you have some game abilities or game elements to it, right? With the gamer leveling with the gods, where you have like a systems panel. They explained this system in a unique way, similar to World After the Fall, where Nyarlathotep, Hotep, one of these ancient ones, these awakened ones, this outer being, kind of controls the system panel for the character in the game, Kim Shinwa. So I thought that was really cool. But there's a lot of unique video game web novels that have really gone this route of like an isekai, where you're transported to your video game character, and this story's no different. Other fun Korean terms I thought I'd go over, besides constellation and stagnant water, is I Became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu games classified as a Munchkin web novel. The Korean term, to my understanding, refers to an overpowered character, right? Our main character has a glass cannon build. He knows magic very well, so it's a little bit of a cheat, right? Um, Munchkin usually refers to a weak to strong or overpowered character. Although considering this Cthulhu setting, I think it's not quite appropriate. I mean, stories like FFF Trash Hero and Shield Hero definitely have a little bit more of a stronger ability, or Arte Fuerta. But I feel like Munchkin can also be a weak to strong. But it is a Korean terminology applied, label applied to a lot of Korean web novels, so it's not a surprise that the our genius mage would be considered a munchkin. The other Korean terminology I thought I'd mention, or interesting terminology I thought I'd mention, in Chinese web novels, this magical ability is called a golden finger. In Korean in Japanese web novels and light novels, they're called a cheat ability. So I thought that was very unique. Um, but certain Korean web novel stories, such as Excellent Supporting Role Replay and Prestigious School, are fluffy web novels, right? The main character, Jo Yun Shin, would be called a sweet potato in for Korean web novel. Sweet potato is just similar to what one might call a cinnamon roll in English, a sweet bun in Chinese, like folds a little padded jacket, has a certain connotation for like daughters, and like 1 pound of oranges is another terminology. But I thought it was interesting to go over like the Korean term sweet potato. We went over Koreans with dealing with outer beings and observers called constellations. But another term I thought I'd like to mention is green tea, right? Tea means like, gossip or news. So green tea in Chinese web novels usually means refers to someone who's backstabbing or scheming. You see this with like Dreaming in the Red Mansions or like a light novel such as The Apothecary Diaries. There's a lot of these characters, right? The expletive term is green tea bitch, but green tea is generally how you refer to like scheming or backstabbing characters. And a lot of BL web novels, the male equivalent would be considered a white lotus, which is kind of two-faced, someone who's scheming or backstabbing but kind of hides it. Although sometimes you call them villains. Other unique um, terminology is golden show, which is like the various dominant person in a BL relationship, but I'm not too well versed in that. But I thought I'd mention that really quickly. So yeah, I became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game really encompasses a lot of like genres, because it's this Cthulhu world. It's very doomed, right? These outer realms and beings and these various cults and factions cause a lot of chaos. So our main character Kim Shin Won knows it's a doomed world. He's obsessed with this video game, so he's a lot of foreknowledge of what happens, right? There's a MacGuffin called this old LeCreux book that in the video game had a lot of power. It's just the research of these outer gods, although that plot line is simply abandoned. And this web novel story is in this urban fantasy setting. It's very similar to Spare Me, Great Lord, Nomenclature of the Night, Solo Leveling, and the Legend Mechanic in terms of the direction it goes in, right? In the Legendary Mechanic, right, where the main character possesses an NPC, that one's much more in a science fiction direction, right, where you have a lot of interesting science fiction adventures. This one's much more urban fantasy, like where you have magical abilities and special factions and whatnot that you have to deal with. Very similar in style to the protagonist. A lot of the magic abilities also are inspired by Solo Leveling, one of the huge Korean web novel touchstones and benchmarks, right? So I became a Genius Mage in the Cthulhu game. It has a very unique start to it. We have a weak to strong sort of route. Some Mages web novels go this sort of slave route with Emperor's Returned, Assassin's Chronicles, The Genius Wizard Takes Medicine, Genius Wizard Sees Rainbows. Um, where our main character is abnormally weak, right? A glass cannon mage's build. But oftentimes, like a slave route with Emperor has returned, or the Genius Mage returns after 4,000 years with Lucas Trauman, there's always this attention of this greater being, right? Or you start off as a slave and then you kind of overcome that, right? Some stories do that arc relatively quickly just to get a character acquainted with the world. But oftentimes when you gain the attention of this being, right? I think there's a World of Warcraft where a mage is like the slave of a drow elf and they gain the attention of these like evil aligned um, deities, um, that kind of becomes the central point of the story, which means you have constantly have this A and B plot where there's always this force chasing after a wizard, which I find kind of closes the story off a little bit because you have to navigate that A and B plot. Nomenclature of the Night does that well by substituting with a new arc once that time passes. Um, but sometimes that's like the end of the story with Surviving the Academy or Extra Academy Survival Guide. And so there's like a lot of pressure to pursue that plot point, and it just really limits like the urban fantasy setting. So I became a Genius Mage with the Cthulhu game, even though of Nyarlathotep controlling like the systems panel and there's a doomed world, it's much more about urban fantasy and a lot of these video game settings. So our main character, Kim Shin-woo, starts off in a secret research lab. There's usually two research lab institutions, Cure Biotech, which I believe is inspired by Cyberpunk, and then Hellistic, which reminds me of the game studio from the game director Return from Hell. K3675 Secret Lab, which reminds me of the Legendary Mechanics start, which also escaped from a secret lab. Our main character navigates this game world right? So there's a lot of familiar game elements to it, right? Tudor, who's this witch that runs Cafe Vasilias, is kind of like uh, runs this guild of sorts. She's a broker for this urban fantasy setting. We see that in similar to like Light Barrier as well, where Kim Shinwa receives quests and dispose or acquires loot from the broker. So Tudor is actually one of the only female characters in the story. She's this witch that runs this cafe, and she's similar to like a guild receptionist or apprentice like Catherine from Genshin Impact, right? She's an NPC that issues quests and that Kim Shinwa constantly works with. Tudor has a bartender named Orb who has an old-fashioned CRT monitor for a head. It's similar to something a character you might see in Persona or a Vocaloid in Echo by Crusher P and Gumi. I thought was very cool. So very interesting science fiction synth wave sort of aesthetic to it. Um, but yeah, most of the cast is like male characters, right? Kim Shinwa meets an NPC called Jang Hyun-duk. He's a black cab driver that transports. It's a service that transports a lot of magical underworld to and from places, especially for quests. He's affiliated with an interesting arc with Dancer Masks and the Yellow Emperor. He has this altar constitution that allows people to summon like the Yellow Emperor, so they want to sacrifice him. And Paradise Abyss doesn't allow idle wanderers. They would be called like the Son of God sort of constitution, where he's the attention of a deity. It's a little bit different from Kim Shinwa, who's this dinner plate feast offering trait. He's just attractive to all these cults and factions. So Kim Shinwa is dealing with a lot of these cults and factions that are like sacrificing things to their respective gods. So there's a lot of chaos. He deals with like cults infestation in apartment buildings, gangsters, a lot of like cursed items, right? There's this very unique arc that explores the Spirited Away setting with like Korean guardians and spirits. So like kind of like in Spirited Away, where you're crossing the bridge and there's a lot of these spirits like trading things. It's kind of like this Gyeomcheong black market area. It's a lot of fun with Jojok lanterns and like a character known as the Professor. Um, but our main character Kim Shin was going through a lot of these magical adventures and story arcs that I find very unique for a web novel of this sort, especially since it's in this video game setting, which is more like game elements and magical ability. So Kim Shin was like this genius mage, and he deals with a lot of these unique events that I find really cool. The big bad evil guy who's in charge of the Hansei Ilyong Church is in collaboration with Migo, one of the other Cthulhu Mythos H.P. Lovecraft characters. Um, and there's a lot of unique events that happen as well. One such event is similar to the Puffin Force video on the Deck of Many Things called The Keep, where adventurers kind of conquer like an abandoned castle. Our main character goes to a starving mansion and meets another male character that becomes his butler called Hyun Sang Hyun, Sang Hyun. Korean is not my native language, so I'm gonna get things wrong. As I said before, this is a glitchy game, so there's a lot of like broken geometry, glitchy furniture and chairs, things stuck in the walls, whether it's like broken 3D objects or furniture as well, even some golems. But our main character, Kim Shin-woo, uses magical abilities to acquire this house, which I find very unique because in a lot of video game novels, like, Possessing Nothing or Rebirth of Thief Who Roamed the World, Reincarnation of the Strongest Sword God, you have to kind of brush up your reputation before you can acquire property. But it was really funny to see, like, this D&D adventure where, you kind of go to this haunted or abandoned house, acquire it, and then that kind of becomes his home base of sorts, right? Jang Hyun-duk, his NPC companion, has a lot of fun adventures with him. They meet like King Mangum, who's like the head of like the black market, this magical black market. And then there's a lot of unique events, right? This is a doomed world after all, because there's a lot of intervention by these outer beings, this Cthulhu um, forces, right? We've alluded to the deep ones. So there's a lot of cults and factions causing chaos, and our main character kind of has to try and figure out a way to escape or get a good ending to it. So our main character has to try to escape or try to find a good ending, right? Because this world is eventually a doomed world, and it has this apocalypse setting that's involved. So yeah, if you're interested in this story of I Became a Genius Mage, the Cthulhu game, there's a lot of fun to be had, right? The Cthulhu mythos, H.P. Lovecraft characters, Munchkin web novel, with like cheat abilities, Golden Finger, it's a story where the main character has a lot of knowledge of the story, a lot of knowledge of the game, right? So I thought that was really cool. But yeah, if you're interested in similar Mage's web novels, definitely go check out A Genius Wizard Takes Medicine, Wizard Sees Rainbows. I became a flashing uh, mage at the I became a flashing genius at the Magic Academy, or other Academy web novels, right? Like The Villain Wants to Live, villainous web novels go that route as well. 30 years have passed since the prologue. Academy's extra Academy's extra survival guide. Definitely a really cool series as well if you're interested in magic web novel. Seal Station Necromancer, one of the older titles, or Kill the Hero. But yeah, that's I became a genius mage at the Cthulhu game. And we'll stop here.